So our standard Fabricator connections is where we can go in, and this allows us to set up defaults for different types of connections. We will be taking a look at this a little later on in the course. So for now, I'll just hit Fabricator to go back to the main project settings screen, and we'll move on to piece marking. In here, we can specify our standard marks for all bolted clip angle connections, our bolted welded clip angles, and all welded clip angles. We'll take a look at this later on as well. Next, we have our standard piece marks for shear plates and end plates. And then we have our member and material piece marking options. If I open that up, here I can specify the main member information from this tab. Do we want to break major marks apart by field bolts, sequence, zone, individual member, or do we want them not broken at all? We have the option to use member mark for member main material in shop bill. This will only call out the member mark for that member's main material in the bill of material and not in the model. So your bill of material would differ than what would be shown inside of your model. And if that option is checked on, you will then have options to show the submaterial mark for beams, columns, vertical braces, horizontal braces, and miscellaneous members. You have the option to use member mark for member main material in shop bill of stair member details. You have the option to show submaterial mark for main material on stair member details. Below that, you can use member mark for member main material in the model. This option is very similar to the first one, but this is going to apply inside of the model. So if you remember, anything that is in the model carries over into your drawings. So that way your marks would match both inside of your model and inside of your bill of material. Next, we have the ability to show linear measure for handrail in shop bill. We can show linear measure for rails, posts, elbows, and grab bars. We have the ability to show submaterial mark for posts and rails on handrail member details. If we go up top, we can change to the submaterial tab. In the submaterial tab, we can set our designation for our primary and secondary submaterial marks. Do we want that to be piece mark only, material type and piece mark, material type, size, and piece mark? What is our starting number for material piece marks? What is our default designation for user added material callout? Do we want a quantity included in our user added bolt callout? Our default designation for user added bolt callout, is that bolt type only or bolt size and type? We can show submaterial quantity on submaterial details. We can show member marks and quantities on submaterial details. Do we want to prefix imperial material callouts that are less than 12 inches with a 0 dash? We can break submaterial marks apart by sequence and by zone. And if we have those options checked on, we can include the sequence or zone in the submaterial mark. We can indicate near side and or far side of submaterial in main view on details. We can show non-standard grade notation with piece marks on member details. We can show piece mark for submaterial bolts on member details. Do we want to reuse piece marks? If this option is checked on, anytime you close out of the model, any mark that was in there at one point but is now no longer inside of the model will become available to be reused. We can force flat bar descriptions to use smaller of length and width, force bent plate description to use the smaller of length and width first. And we want to show piece marks in all views on member details. In the group tab, For submember piece marking options, do we want to combine all like submembers contained within all grouped members, or do we want to combine all liked submembers by same grouped member piece mark? And we can specify if we want to use member mark for member main material in shop bill of group member details, and do we want to use group mark for main submembers main material mark in the model. And next we have prefixes. So this will allow us to change any prefixes for any of our material shapes. We also have the ability to rename the description prefixes for plates down here as well. I'll go ahead and cancel out of this. Next we have our member descriptions. In here we can specify what we want different member descriptions to display as on our member details as well as in the bill of material. And then the piece mark prefixes tab. Inside of here we can specify how it's going to call out our piece marks inside of our model, and also when we go to do our detail sheet auto loading, what designation do we want to use for our different member types. I will cancel out of this and go back to our Fabricator options. Next we have our Sheets and Reports tab. This allows us to set up the bill of material, sheet revisions, and loading options. After that we have our Detailing tab. Inside of the Detailing tab we have a lot of different settings we can set up. We'll start looking at dimension settings. So across the top we have our General tab, Beam, Column, Brace, and Miscellaneous. So under the General tab we can specify our dimension terminals. Do we want arrows or slash? Our submaterial sloping hole layout dimensions to on work line, farthest hole, nearest hole, or none. Also the same for our main material sloping hole layout dimensions. For our main material sloping hole extension dimensions, do we want that to go to the top leftmost hole, the bottom leftmost hole, the bottom rightmost hole, or the top rightmost hole? We can show point-to-point distance on main dimension. We can show material grade on main dimension. Do we want to show on radius dimension for arc dimensions? Show angle dimension for arc dimensions, either no, as degrees, as radians, or as degrees, minutes, and seconds. We can specify if we want to break dimension lines at label interference, if we want to break material lines at label interference, or if we want to break the bevel lines at the label interference. Do we want to combine dimensions across detail? Our extension dimensions on submaterial details. We want extension dimension tails on submaterial details. What our material point dimension holdback distance is. For drawing editor system generated details and submaterial detail restrictions, we can specify if we want to lock the outline layer or lock manual editing of dimension text. And then our display measurement unit for angle dimensions as degrees, as radians, and then we can specify our angle dimension precision. We'll switch over to the beam tab. For beams, do we want to show extension dimensions? Do we want to show extension dimension tails or the extension dimension origin? Do we want to dimension reference points on symmetrical web holes or flange holes? Show chain dimensions between hole groups? Show extension dimensions from left or right? And then extension dimensions from bolted, welded, and specify if that is from end of beam or the face of connection. Same for copes dimension from. And do we want to show end of beam to face of clip angle dimension? For columns, the same similar type settings. Do we want to show extension dimensions, to show extension dimension tails, or origin? The dimension reference point on symmetrical web and flange holes. Show chain dimensions between hole groups. The show extension dimension is from the top or the bottom. Extension dimensions from the top of plate or bottom of plate. And then our overall dimension from, for cap and base, doing with that from top of plate or bottom of plate. For the brace tab, for horizontal braces and vertical braces, do we want to show extension dimensions, the extension dimension tails or origin? We want a dimension reference point on symmetrical web or flange holes, show chain dimension between hole groups, and show extension dimensions from left or right. And for the miscellaneous, we can show extension dimension tails. For our rolled plate lengths, the rolled plate width dimension, is that taken from the outside, center, or the inside? For our bent plate lengths, do we want our bent plate lengths calculated at center line for all plate thicknesses, or do we want to use a custom K factor? Our unfolded surface template bend lines, we want to show beginning and ending bend lines. And then we can have the option to choose the pen color and line type for our beginning bend line, our center bend line, and our ending bend line. Since we didn't change anything in any of these tabs, I will go ahead and say cancel here. And we can go into our drawing presentation. Inside of our drawing presentation, we have a lot of different tabs in here which we'll go through. So starting at sizes, you can specify what our label's character height is, what our label's width height ratio is, the section size character height, and the section size width height ratio, as well as our piece mark character and our piece mark width height ratio, what our weld symbol's character height is. Can choose our size of dimension terminals, our size of pointer arrowheads, and our size of work point symbols. Next, we have our fonts. In here, we can choose the font and font style for labels, dimensions, symbols, member labels, member piece mark labels, member section size labels, our bill of material, and our sheet revisions. Next would be our pens. In here you can choose the different color you want for your different bill label pen, detailing label, our pointer, section size, piece mark, member, cloud, weld, dimension, bevel, grid line bubble pen, filled hole, hatch pen, and our member detail pen color. Next is our bill of material. Our spaces between fields in the bill of material, do we want 1 or 2? Our bill items character height. We can specify our bill items width height ratio. Do we want to show grid or wrap fields to next line? We can specify what our rotation is, what our outside and inside pen color is. We can set up what our maximum spacing between items is and our maximum and minimum number of rows. We can choose what our title text is, what our title character width height ratio is, and then we can choose our title font and font style and our header font and header font style. Next would be our revision chart. So some similar settings. Do we want to show grid, wrap fields to the next line, how many number of lines we have, what our header position is, our order of revision lines, is that top to bottom or is that bottom to top, what our rotation is, our anchor location, is that upper left, upper right, lower left or lower right, what our character height and character width height ratio is, and then what our column title font and font style is, as well as our outside and inside pen colors. For tables, what is our outside and inside pen color, our rotation, our anchor location. Do we want to show grid? For our header on tables, we can choose our font and font style. Our justification is at left, center, or right. Our character height and our character width height ratio, and what our pen color is, and the same exact settings for our body for tables. Next would be our primary dimensions. So for our primary dimensions, do we want to use our imperial or metric units? This, when we set up our project, we specified we wanted to use our metric units, so that's where that comes from. We can lock primary units. We can change our character height and character width height ratio. Do we want to expand dimensions less than or equal to? And then we can change our dimension precision, as well as our dimension label pen color. Next, we can choose to show our secondary dimensions. If we have our show secondary dimensions option turned on, we have the same exact setup options for our primary dimensions. Do we want those units to be imperial or in metric? We can choose our character height, our character width height ratio, and our pen color. And then lastly, we have our colors. So these are for our different layers. If we want to specify our user adjusted, layer color, our detail rule annotation, reference dimension, user annotation, system annotation, our outline, new comment layer, or new layer color. I will cancel out of this window. Next, we'll take a look at our line weights. In here is where we can specify our thickness and color of our pens when we are plotting. The pen numbers you see here are going to correlate with our pen colors, in which we already looked at inside of the drawing presentation tab. So as you can see here, pen number 1 will correlate with the color white. Color red will be for pen number 2. Yellow will be number 3. Green will be number 4. Cyan will be number 5. Blue will be number 6. And magenta will be for the number 7 pen color. I'll cancel out of this line weights window and I'll move on to the general presentation. Up top here for detail scales, we can specify our default member detail scales as well as our submaterial detail scales. We can choose our default member detail scale by our nominal size. We can choose what our rolled section standard edge distance and our plate material standard edge distance is. We can also show non-standard edge distances. Marked for detailing, we can clear detail flag when detailing current piece mark. You can either prompt, never, or immediately. And our prompt default is that set yes or no. For shop bill weight, we can specify our shop bill weight precision. Do we want to always round unit weights up? For our weights, do we want those to always add up, or do we want the actual total weights? For shop bill weight based on material, do we want volume or dimensions? Dimensions will include any cuts or holes that are in that material. It will not subtract those weights. Whereas if it was set to volume, the system will account for those cuts and holes and it would subtract the weight out. For detailed drawing options, do we want to show cross hatching? Do we want to show cut surface hatching? Face AC holes shown in face CA view on member details. And we can also show face BD holes shown in face DB, view on member detail for cruciform columns. Can show main member size. Can show the K distance with main member size. Do we want to show some material layout dimensions on our member detail? We can show shot bolt slotted holes, and we can specify our minimum slot length. Do we want to use curved pointers? We can use pointer face indicators. And for our single quantity designation in main callout on details, do we want it 1 as it's spelled out, or just the number 1? I will cancel out of this general presentation, and we can go into our bolt detailing settings. So for bolt designation shown on details and reports, do we want bolt material only or bolt material and type? Are field bolts listed on which members, the supporting or the supported member? Do we want to plot field bolt bill of material information? We can summarize field bolt list in bill of material. We can include unit quantities and weights for field bolts in the bill of material as well. Do we want to summarize like field bolts on details? We can list washers and secondary nut with field bolts on details. We can specify if we want to summarize like shop bolts on details, as well as list washers and secondary nuts with shop bolts on details. Our bolt summary format on details is that unit quantity, total quantity, or unit and total quantities. For our bolt, nut, and washer callouts, we can include units of measure. And do we want the diameter symbol displayed? Do we want to spell out DIA for diameter, or do we want it set to none? And we can also have our bolt, nut, and washer broken out in bill of material. I'll cancel out of here and move on to the connection erectability settings. We have the option to use oversized holes in beam moment flange plates. We can choose our default section size for our angle, our stability angle. We can show field bolted stability angles either on the beam, on the column, or have them shipped loose. What is our maximum amount of allowable K infringement? Do we want to use backing bar for pre-qualified welds? And do we want to do weld prep on moment flange plates? For our safety erection seat options, we can specify our default section size for the seat angle. Our safety erection seat connection to supporting, is that bolted or welded? Do we want to attach the long leg to the supported or the supporting member? Our gauge on leg to supported and supporting member? And what is our gap for safety seat on bottom flange? And then down below here we have some bolt detailing options. So based off of what your bolt size is over here, we can specify what our spacing is, what our tension controlled tool type is that a large or small? And then we can specify what our, for a non-tension controlled tool and a large and small tension controlled tool, these different values. So we can specify what our H1 is, our H2 distances, our C1 diameter for large and small, our C2 and our C3. Go ahead and cancel out of this. And for our member detailing settings, we will go down the list here of each different tab. So to start off with beams, do we want our preferred bottom flange view style set to cross section or a worm's eye view? We can provide our minimum cope depth, what our minimum clearance for cope is, what our minimum cope radius center clearance from face of flange, what do we want a round cope length or depth to nearest? We can specify what our cope radius is, Our cope cut type is that perpendicular to the web angle or parallel to the flange. We can round off material length where possible. We can specify what our member end edge distance is. Do we want to square cut ends of sloped beams? We want to square cut ends for spliced beam connection. Detailed for beam member details, do we want those in position or horizontal? If you had a sloped beam and that was set to in position, the detail would also be sloped. If it's set to horizontal, that detail will always be horizontal even if the beam is sloped. We can specify if we want to show design loads on details. We can either have that set to none, input, or all. And if that is set to input or all, we can show member quantities or show member numbers. Same goes for our capacity loads on our details. Do we want to show grid notes on details? Either none, one, or all. We can show end elevation on details, none, first, or all. And our end elevation reference point, is that coming from our material end or our work point? We can add work point dimensions, and we can show camber on the bill of material, and we can specify how that looks. So right now that is C equals. Moving on to our columns, we'll have the same similar type settings. In here we can specify if we want to see our preferred baseplate view orientations as a bird's eye view or a worm's eye view. We want to show C face on details, either as required, always, or never. And the same settings for A face on details. Do we want to annotate faces of pipe on details? We want to mill cut column ends. We can show erection pinholes. And if that's option checked on, do we want to make our erection pinholes CNC downloadable? Specify what our erection pinhole diameter is and what our vertical edge distance of the hole. Do we want to detail columns in position, vertical, or horizontal? We can show design loads and capacity loads, either none, input, or all. And do we want to show member quantities or member numbers for those? We can show grid notes on details. We can show end elevation on details. Our top elevation reference point, is that coming from the material end or work point? And we can show sections framing into a column. And then a sub tab of the columns is our shear through plate. Have a couple different settings here. So for our shear through plates on columns, we can specify our HSS notch radius and what our total notch width clearance is. Next, we'll go to vertical braces. We want to locate angle braces on neutral axis. We can specify what our minimum member end edge distance is. Our gusset to supporting member, is at welded or a clip angle. Do we want to detail vertical braces in position or horizontal? We have the same setup options to show design loads and show capacity loads. Do we want to show grid notes on details? We can show end elevations at work points on details. Our HSS erection bolts, is that none, one, or two? Specify what our hole type is for HSS erection bolts. Intersection gusset notch preparations. Do we want a rounded slot or weld a round end? What is our HSS notch radius? Our total notch width clearance, and our HSS double paddle clearance. We want a welded angle end weld or welded angle balance welds, and what our maximum web stiffener thickness is. And then a sub tab of the vertical braces for clip angle connection of gusset to supporting member. Our gusset to clip connection, is that welded or bolted? Can specify our default clip angle section size. Do we want to attach the long leg to supported or supporting? Our hole type for supported and the supporting. We can specify our gauge on the supporting and supported member. Do we want to stagger bolts? And use expanded bolt spacing. Moving on to horizontal braces. Some of the same similar setup options. We want to locate angle braces on neutral axis. What our minimum member end edge distance is. Our gusset to single beam connections, is that welded or clip angle? Do we want to detail horizontal braces in position or horizontally? Same setup options to show design loads and capacity loads. Do we want to show grid notes on details? Our back-to-back angle stitch plate gap, we can specify what that is. Do we want to allow material work line offset? Our HSS erection bolts, is that none, 1, or 2? Our hole type for HSS erection bolts, we can specify what our HSS notch radius is, what our total notch width clearance is, and our HSS double paddle clearance. Do we want welded angle end weld or welded angle balance welds? And what our maximum web stiffener thickness is. And again, a sub-tab of the horizontal braces, our clip angle connection of gusset to supporting member. The gusset to clip connection, is that welded or bolted? And the beam to clip connection, is that welded or bolted? Do we want to attach the clip to gusset or supporting? Do we want to attach the gusset to brace or supporting? Gusset clips, do we want to specify them on both sides, near side, or the far side? Can specify what our default clip angle section size is. Reattaching that long leg to the supported or the supporting member. Can specify our hole types for the supported and supporting members. Our double gauge on supporting member, and what our single gauge on supporting member is. Our gauge measured from gusset center line or GOL, gauge on leg. Specify what our gauge on supported member is. Do we want to stagger bolts? And then our clip to gusset dimension. Moving on to handrail. Do we want that noted at top rail from not noted, top of top rail, or center of top rail? And we also have the option to be noted at the bottom of the post. Moving on to stairs. Our preferred stringer auxiliary view orientation, is that from the outside or the inside? And our new stair stringer length on bill of material and detail, is that pre-cut or post-cut? For stitch plates, you can specify a type of spacer for double bracing. You want a bolted ring, bolted plate, or a welded plate. Type of spacer for welded connections. Our max allowed stitch plate spacing. So our minimum number of allowed stitch plates. So our stitch plate extension beyond brace and our stitch plate width. If those are set to auto, the system will automatically decide on what those distances are. For miscellaneous, we want our miscellaneous members detailed in position, horizontally, or vertically. We can add bearing bar thickness to description in the bill of material for grading material. And we can also add bearing bar thickness to description in bill of material for grading tread material. And then for tension only braces or rod braces, our length of bottom rod for rod bracing. What is our length of rod brace thread? Specify the gap between rod braces at turnbuckle. And for our pin type, is that a headed or cotter pin? So I will cancel out of this. And next is our member view defaults. So based on the member type for each view that comes in, here we can specify what our in and out depth is. We will leave all of these set to be default or auto. If that's set to auto, SDS2 will automatically set these distances for you. You can also do the same for your material view defaults if you wanted to specify something different for any material, you can do that as well. We will leave all of our set to auto. I will cancel out of this window here, and next we will look at our detailing defaults. Here we can specify for our members, group members, or submaterial how those will be detailed. So to go down the list here, we want to preserve existing drawing annotations. You can either preserve none, preserve user created, or preserve all, ignore drawing piece marks, or all, update drawing piece marks. You can check on if we want to detail using templates. Do we want to remove snap lines, verbose progress updates, can show applied templates. Do we want to dimension user created material, dimension holes on user created material. We can show non-annotated system views. Can preserve system set detail flags, preserve user modified bill of material. We want to detail with revisions, and to shorten drawings. I will cancel out of here. Next is our non-standard field bolts on erection views. Here we can specify how we want those non-standard field bolts called out on erection views. Detail erection view defaults. We will take a look at this a little bit later on when we start detailing our erection views. Our detailing symbol settings. We can specify what our bevel symbol base dimension is. Do we want to show bevel angle degrees with bevel symbol? Can combine weld symbols. Can allow weld symbol to be drawn on material. Do we want to use pre-qualified weld tail text by default? Add weld leader cranks always or as needed. Can allow hole symbol to be drawn on material. Allow piece mark to be drawn on material. Do we want to show paint stripe on framing side of shear plates? You can show non-standard hole sizes on detailed drawings. You want to show non-quad boundary slot rotations with symbol note on detailed drawings. Can call out standard holes with mixed bolt hole units on details. Our designation for non-standard holes on details is at cloud or pointer. And then the cloud and note holes having slip critical bolts on member details, and we have 3 lines that we can specify what we want there if that option is checked on. Next is our galvanizing settings. Under this general tab, we can specify some different kettle defaults. Do we want to automatically break apart galvanized members? Galvanized member default material surface finish. Do we want that galvanized or duplex coating? Our default vent drain hole diameter, and what our default vent drain hole plug type is. Add galvanized duplex coating label to remarks column in the bill of material. You want to add no chromate quench note to detail for members with the duplex coating. And we can cloud and note vent drain holes on member details. We'll cancel out of the galvanizing settings. Our erection view member labels we will not get into. CNC center marks. Do we want to show the center marks by default? Position and match marks. Do we want to include position marking where it would go through and it would add in pop marks for your different framing situations here? In this case, we won't go into any of these settings. I will go back here to our Fabricator settings. Below our detailing, we have our concrete and rebar. If we had concrete and rebar information, this is where we could set those settings up. In this case, we don't, so we won't get into it. Our crane limits and appearance. This will allow us to specify how cranes are shown. Stair treads is where you would set up your default tread types. We will go into this further later on in the course when we start working with stairs. Our category settings, we can specify any categories we may need to. User routings. This will allow us to set up user routing definitions to be used in our job, which we won't really get into these settings at all. And we have our project output. This will allow us to specify our default output areas for reports, drawing conversion, CNC, BIF, estimating, production, our design link, model link, and parametrics. And then lastly, if we wanted, we could print out our Fabricator settings.